Have you ever walked through life feeling invisible, convinced that your past mistakes have disqualified you from hope, love, or a second chance? The cumulative weight of rejection can feel like a life sentence, leaving you parched in a spiritual desert. What if I told you that the most scarred and overlooked person in an entire city was the one specifically chosen by God for the most profound revelation of his identity? What if your greatest shame is precisely the stage God wants to use for your most powerful comeback story? This is the story of the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. She was an outcast, a walking scandal forced to endure the scorching midday sun to avoid the vicious judgment of others. Yet her pain was about to intersect with the divine. An encounter that lasted mere minutes would rewrite her future, save an entire city, and ultimately deliver a timeless truth. You are chosen. Prepare to see how one simple conversation transformed a life from utter despair to ultimate purpose. Imagine the scene. It's high noon in Samaria. The heat is not just intense, it's merciless. A physical punishment reflecting the emotional torment this woman carried. The dusty path shimmered under the blinding sun, and you could hear the insects buzzing, but you wouldn't hear human voices. Why? Because the societal norms demanded that women fetch water during the cool social hours of dawn or dusk. Those were the times for laughter, conversation, and community. But for her, community was a source of pain. This woman was engaged in a deliberate act of emotional self-preservation. Every solitary step she took toward Jacob's well was a step away from judgmental eyes and cutting whispers. She knew the gossip. She knew the contempt, and facing that scorching sun was a vastly preferable burden to facing her peers. That empty water jar she carried wasn't just a container for H2O. It was a perfect visual metaphor for her life. It represented the void she tried desperately to fill, a void left by 5 failed relationships, and the 6th attempt that was equally empty. Her physical throat was parched, yes, but the thirst she truly suffered from was a profound spiritual aching for acceptance, for forgiveness, for someone to finally see her not as her mistakes, but as a soul worthy of belonging. This woman arrived at the well carrying the deepest, most unspoken thirst of all. To truly grasp her desperation, we must look at the invisible weight she was carrying, the notorious record of her life. The Bible reveals a staggering detail: 5 marriages. This wasn't merely a statistic. It was a devastating pattern of seeking completion in human affection. A relentless, painful cycle where hope was raised only to be brutally crushed 5 separate times. Each wedding was a promise, each divorce a public scar, and each subsequent failure cemented her own belief in her brokenness. Now, she lived with a man who was not her husband, a final despairing attempt to find stability that cemented her status as an irreparable pariah. In the eyes of the women who avoided her in the cool morning, she wasn't just a sinner. She was the cautionary tale, a living, breathing sermon on what not to become. Imagine the scene again, not at the well, but on the narrow, crowded streets. When she passed, mothers instinctively pulled their daughters closer, not out of malice, but out of fear of contagion. The conversations didn't just stop. They died, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence and averted eyes, as if looking at her might taint them. Every single one of those deliberate acts of avoidance was a stone added to the high, impenetrable wall she'd built around her heart. She didn't just feel rejected. She was systematically, publicly, and repeatedly confirmed as unworthy of true connection. She believed the devastating lie society sold her, that her mistakes were her permanent identity, that her failures were a life sentence, and that surely God himself had abandoned the project that was her life. This painful isolation is the emotional depth charge, the total emptiness of her jar, against which the startling, barrier-shattering intervention is about to take place. Her entire history was a desperate cry for validation, and only when she stopped seeking it from the world would she find the one who saw her story without judging it. When she finally reached the well, bracing herself for the solitary task, she saw him. a Jew. He was sitting there, looking serene, yet deeply marked by the weariness of travel, a figure entirely out of place for this time and location. Her carefully constructed defensive posture immediately snapped into place. Her first instinct, fueled by centuries of deep-seated sectarian hostility and amplified by her own painful history of being judged, was to lower her gaze and disappear into her work, hoping to be as usual unseen. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was poisoned. They were not merely neighbors with a feud, but sworn enemies who shared no common ground, exchanged no pleasantries, and certainly would never use the same drinking vessels. The chasm between their peoples was monumental, yet the invisible wall of intense societal judgment surrounding her specifically was even higher and more suffocating. She expected the typical response: contemptuous silence, a cold stare, or a dismissive gesture. But then, the unimaginable happened. 3 simple earth-shaking words shattered the oppressive silence and every single social protocol of the age. "Give me a drink." This was not just a request for hydration. It was an act of audacious radical inclusion. Jesus wasn't prioritizing his thirst for water. He was prioritizing the connection. In that single sentence, he deliberately tore down 3 colossal barriers. First, the barrier of ethnicity, a Jew, a holy man speaking to a Samaritan, a despised outcast. Second, the barrier of gender, a man speaking publicly to a woman alone, an act highly scandalous for a rabbi. And the most monumental barrier of all, the barrier of reputation, a teacher engaging with a notorious 5-time failed woman. Her shock wasn't polite. It was visceral disbelief. "How can you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Her question was loaded. It wasn't just geographical or racial. It was a deeply wounded personal challenge. She was saying, "Don't you know the rules? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know how unclean I am?" But Jesus bypassed the labels, ignored the broken jar, and dismissed the 5 failures. He saw a soul ready to be seen. In that moment, he validated her humanity by simply asking for something, thereby acknowledging her existence and shattering the narrative of her unworthiness. The dialogue that followed was inevitable, because when Jesus speaks to you, he always meets you exactly where you are, but he absolutely refuses to leave you there. Jesus didn't pause to defend why he spoke to her. Instead, he elevated the conversation immediately from the mundane to the miraculous, from the physical well to the spiritual heart. He said, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." This concept was a radical spiritual leap for the woman. Her mind still tethered to the reality of her empty jar, and the backbreaking labor of drawing water from a deep pit was thoroughly confused. Living water. How could this man, who visibly lacked the necessary tools, no rope, no bucket, offer something so transformative? She challenged him based on the visible and the tangible, asking if he was greater than their ancestor Jacob, who dug the well. But Jesus persisted with divine, unwavering patience, drawing a clear, profound distinction between the temporary solutions of the world and the eternal satisfaction he offered. "Everyone who drinks of this water from the well will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst." He was offering more than just refreshment. He was promising a permanent spring welling up inside her, a source of peace, identity, forgiveness, and fulfillment that could never run dry, regardless of her circumstances or reputation. After years, decades of carrying an empty jar and trying desperately to quench her spiritual ache with broken relationships and societal acceptance that never materialized, those words, "never thirst," hit like a lightning bolt. They bypassed her analytical mind and resonated deep within the chambers of her rejected heart. The physical jar was empty, yes, but her soul was screaming for this eternal solution. Her reply filled with a new urgent desperation. "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty and not have to keep coming here to draw water," showed she was finally instinctively asking for the right thing. She had shifted her focus from the labor of her life to the source of life. Jesus was about to grant her wish, not by filling her physical jar, but by showing her the true source of her devastating spiritual thirst. The conversation took a sharp, personal turn. Jesus, responding to her request for water, didn't hand her a cup. Instead, he gave her a command that struck straight to the heart of her deepest shame. "Go call your husband and come here." Her heart must have plummeted. This was the moment of exposure she had always sought to avoid by walking alone. She offered a quick defensive lie. "I have no husband." But Jesus didn't use her lie as a weapon. He used the truth as a bridge. He looked at her not with the contemptuous glare she knew so well, but with perfect compassion and said, "You have said rightly, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." He knew. He knew every shattered vow, every secret hope, every lonely night, and every mistake she thought was hidden from the world. But here is the radical beauty. He exposed her past, but he offered her a future. There was no condemnation in his voice, only truth wrapped in immeasurable grace. This wasn't a cruel public shaming. It was a private loving unveiling that said, "I see your story, I know your pain, and I still choose you." The woman, realizing she was speaking to no ordinary man, proclaimed, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." She tried to divert the conversation back to religious debates about where to worship, perhaps hoping to regain control. But Jesus steered her past the rituals, past the history, and straight to the monumental climax of the entire encounter. She declared her hope. "I know that the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will tell us everything." And Jesus, the Lord of the universe, the promised Redeemer, chose this broken, rejected woman to be the recipient of his open, unprecedented declaration, "I who speak to you am he." Time stopped. The greatest truth ever spoken was delivered not to a priest, not to a Pharisee, but to a Samaritan outcast whose failures were known to all. This is the heart of God. He reveals himself first to those the world deems least worthy. What happened next is the tangible evidence of genuine spiritual transformation. The Bible records that the woman left her water jar and ran back to the city. Think about that powerful detail. She came for water that was her entire reason for exposing herself to the midday sun. Yet the jar, the symbol of her need, her old routine, and her empty life, was suddenly irrelevant. She left it behind. She had found the living water, and now the physical vessel no longer mattered. Her emptiness was filled. The woman who had previously chosen isolation and silence now chose public exposure and proclamation. She forgot the heat. She forgot the judgmental stares she used to dread, because something burning inside her was far hotter than the sun, the conviction of having met the Messiah. She rushed back to the very people who had scorned her, to the very streets where she was ridiculed, and her message was irresistible. She didn't offer a polished religious speech. She offered her raw, painful truth. "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Is this not the Christ?" She didn't minimize her mistakes. She used them as proof. Her greatest shame was instantly transformed into her most powerful testimony. True conversion means proclaiming that God's power is greater than our most embarrassing secret. This formerly rejected woman, the unworthy, became Samaria's first missionary, and through her unapologetic story, many of the Samaritans believed. Her rejection became a platform. Her pain found its ultimate purpose. The story of the Samaritan woman is not an isolated historical event. It is a fundamental theological statement about God's character. Why did Jesus choose her, the notorious outcast, for this monumental revelation? Because throughout Scripture, God deliberately chooses the unlikely. He chose David, the overlooked shepherd, for the throne. He chose Paul, the violent persecutor, to be the greatest apostle. He doesn't choose based on your resume, your reputation, or your moral perfection. He chooses based on a willing, thirsty heart. The woman at the well proves that God's unconditional love makes no distinction between the worthy and the unworthy, because we are all unworthy and desperately need His grace. 2,000 years later, that woman is still speaking to us. The simple life-changing truth is this: the Samaritan woman is you. She is me. She is us. We all carry empty jars. We all walk through emotional and spiritual deserts, trying to quench our deepest thirst with temporary worldly things, success, status, relationships, or distraction. And every single time we become thirsty again. Jesus is sitting at your well today. Not Jacob's well, but the place you go for fleeting satisfaction. He knows the number of your failures. He knows the secrets you hide. But He looks at you with grace, not condemnation, and He extends the same radical invitation. Stop carrying your empty jar. Stop trying to earn acceptance. He offers the living water that satisfies forever. No matter how deep your thirst, no matter how great your shame, no matter who has rejected you, God chooses you. Will you leave your past behind, just like she left that jar, and run towards the one who has already run entire worlds to meet you?